I've just came from a strategic game which was conducted by the Center for International Strategic Studies in Georgetown University, where I played in the red team, on the Soviet side team, in the crisis game developing very rapidly in our world, with the financial crisis growing up in Latin America with debt defaults and whatnot, with the Contras suddenly moving more actively into Managua, and a number of other crises. And I'm sure that you wouldn't be surprised to learn that we actually won. I mean, the Soviet side won, and won very easily, and amazingly easily, and even frighteningly easily. At the end of the crisis, which continued for 1 month, we had Pakistan partitioned and the Pakistani regime disintegrated very easily. There was no problem at all. We swept away all the problems in Central America and were ready to move anywhere, particularly in El Salvador. This is frightening ease with which the Soviet side can operate in the world, which I felt for the last 2 days of these games, is very close to reality, as indeed the scenario of this crisis is very close to reality. It was very realistic indeed. And it shows you suddenly two very important weaknesses or strengths of the Soviet regime. Weaknesses of the West and strengths of the West of the Soviet regime. One of them is the Soviet system has to its disposal much more instrument of political influence in any crisis, much more dimensions of fighting, to which the Western side has no response whatsoever. It simply has no means for it, no instruments at all. We could use the public opinion in the West freely. We could appeal to the left-wing specter of the political specter of these countries, using it, a very powerful tool during the developing crisis. We could use guerrillas very easily. We could use a lot of things. And the Western side could generate only 1 out of 5 responses to our moves. They simply had no means. That's one of the frightening things which underlines the unpreparedness of the West to a real crisis, to a real development of crisis with the Soviet system as it is right now, which was developing these tools for the last 50, 60 years. And unless we give attention to this ideological warfare and some other aspects of what the Soviet Union gives, unless we have some capability of meeting this challenge, our future seems to be very dire. Another conclusion to which we came during these games was of more profound, more philosophical nature. As we have learned at the end of the game, the American side, the blue team, so to speak, in this game, was mostly engaged in debates in between themselves, while we were very action-oriented, having a very clearly defined goal in our minds, and we're mainly involved in the development of our moves. The Americans apparently were always arguing about, in between themselves, about the concepts. They still had no concept of what the Soviet system is about, or what is possible to do with it, and what they actually want in all these areas of conflict, how they go about to reaching their goals. That raises a very important question. Indeed, it's amazing that although the Soviet Union exists now 68 years and developed a lot of, made a lot of conflicts in this world and has been tremendously successful, and undeniably the communist ideology as such and the Soviet system as its incarnation is the biggest problem of our century. I think nobody would deny that. If nothing else, the scope of misery it inflicted on the humanity alone is unprecedented. Yet, we probably know less about the Soviet system, I mean, by we, I mean the Western side, than we know about the other side of the moon or about the very distant galaxy. That is appalling. It still lacks a coherent concept of the Soviet system. And when you go to those who are supposed to know that, the so-called experts, you suddenly find them divided into two categories, so-called hardliners and softliners. I don't believe that this popular wisdom is correct. As far as I'm concerned, there is no hardliners or softliners. There are correct or incorrect policies, correct or incorrect decisions. The recent summit meeting with all the positive sides it also brought a lot of negative sides. You certainly have seen our televisions, our media being sort of submerged by goodwill, and we certainly had a reappearance of a lot of so-called experts on friendship with the Soviet Union, utilizing all the time in the media, who would once again repeat all the old but bankrupt ideas about how we should proceed by getting more understanding with the Soviet Union, as if 68 years of its existence was not sufficient to understand it, how we should find a good negotiations. There's still great belief among many people in this world that if you negotiate very understandingly with the Soviet Union, if you give them, a sort of benefit of a doubt and wouldn't be that intolerant, then you suddenly would come to a very good terms with it, which is remarkably mistaken. But at the same time, I must say, there is a flaw in the conservative thinking about the Soviet side too. One most important mistake is a belief very well rooted in conservative thinking that the Soviet Union is unchangeable, that you cannot change and cannot expect any changes in the Soviet Union. And that's a very great mistake. Soviet Union does changes, and there are many ways of bringing these changes or make policy conducive to these changes. Let me say that, ironically, right now, the Soviet Union probably in one of the on the brink of many dramatic changes, provided our policy toward it is correct. They do have a tremendous economic problem, which was sort of building up for many years, and now came to a point when they themselves recognize they cannot proceed with what we are doing before. They openly say that their inefficient, extensive economy cannot any longer sustain the effort of expansion and military competition with the West. That notion came first in the speech of Gorbachev he gave to the Central Committee in April of last year, when he said that unless we go into the pattern of radical reorganization in our economy, the cause of socialism in the world will be threatened. Let me just quote you to give you the sense of crisis they have. Let me just quote you nothing else but the Communist Party magazine in the Soviet Union, called Communist, quite appropriately. What they say: further movement along this course, meaning the present course of development of economy, in the situation when the possibility of involvement of labor, or raw materials, and natural resources into production is reduced, could only lead to an increased number of unfilled jobs, to an excessive growth of expenditure for development and transportation of mineral resources, and for protection of environment. This way of development has no prospects now. More and more investment will yield less and less interest. The result: in the present conditions, this would be a dead end. That is a very important thing. We know, by knowing Soviet system, that it cannot change dramatically to such an extent as to make any economic reforms working. But in going to that direction, it may involve itself into a very dangerous development, which might finally dismantle the political control system as it exists now. So briefly speaking, shortly presenting it, the more they go into the intensive production and intensive economy, the less party control is possible. And the less party control you have over the economy, the less you have party control over the country as such. And that they cannot do. What can be done on this side, which might sort of force the Soviet Union to go into the bigger and deeper reforms than they actually want to do? Very simple. The reason for their concern is not the well-being of their population, it's the strategic problems and the problems of expansion of the empire. So in order to make them to force them to go into deeper reforms, you have to, first of all, continue and even increase your competition in military field, meaning the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And if you increase it, then the Soviets will have more incentive into going to deeper reforms. If you cancel Strategic Defense Initiative, they will have less incentive for that. Secondly, you have to increase their expenditures and efforts in the expansion in the Third World, meaning that you have to support the resistance forces, making for the Soviet Union their involvement there and maintenance of the empire more and more expensive, more and more difficult. If you stop that, if we suddenly turn the current trend and start to help Mozambique communist government, as some people do right now in administration, if we start to do the same in Angola, like the Gulf Oil doing right now, instead of helping the resistance forces over there, if we suddenly decide out of some strange idea in the State Department that we can buy a Soviet empire from the Soviet Union, then we will kill the incentive for reforms inside of the Soviet Union, and we'll have for ourselves bought a very expensive and useless instrument. Finally, and very importantly, if we go right now into the path of détente again, as it's suggested by some aspects of the public debate, then we also will kill the current trend for reform. If we start to supply the Soviet Union with credits, technology, goods on a great scale as the Soviet Union wants it, we would simply kill any incentive for the Soviet Union to go into economic changes, endangering their system. And quite recently, as you know, 400 American businessmen came together with Secretary for Commerce, Baldrige, to Moscow to negotiate all these agreements. I would say, from the standpoint of American interest, as well as from standpoint of the interest of the Soviet population, this American businessman has no business to do in the Soviet Union and shouldn't go there. What actual basic concept could be used to build a coherent policy towards the Soviet Union? I believe such a basic concept was already given by the President Reagan in his speech to the United Nations in October of last year, where he said that peace based on repressions cannot be true peace, and is secure only when individuals are free to direct their own governments. Developing further this idea, he said, Marxism-Leninism's war with the people become war with their neighbors, and it's a very profound remark. And indeed, the Soviet system is based on some kind of a hidden, latent civil war between the communist rulers and the population. And the free world can be either on the side of our oppressors and the government, seeking understanding with them, or on the side of population, promoting their search for freedom. And that, I believe, should be developed if the conservatives have any influence on the event as a coherent policy. Unfortunately, that is not so at the moment. The first documents came out of summit are disastrous. The agreement about exchanges, cultural and scientific exchange is a disaster. It's a Soviet document which gives the Soviets all the control of the process, which will enforce their control over their own intellectuals and people, allows them to select those whom they want to go abroad and have the advantage of communicating with the free world. It also suggested an increase in scientific exchange and even joint work and research in the nuclear fusion problem. At the same time, when 5,000 American scientists still boycott the Soviet scientific institutions, demanding that Sakharov, Orlov, and Sharansky be released. What right has the governments to sign such an agreement with the Soviet Union at the time when the 5,000 of their own scientists, a huge community, demands the boycott? I don't know. Concluding what I wanted to say, I would like to underline that it's feasible, possible, and totally coherent with what is the demands of our time and the future challenges if we develop such a policy in which the free world and oppressed people, not the governments of the communist countries, will be together, fighting together for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bukovsky. Therein, in the remarks of Mr. Bukovsky, lies the elements of the strategy for the West. Not to relax the pressure when the momentum is in our direction. And not relaxing that pressure means not to be swayed in the slightest by any calls for the reestablishment of détente, even under the name of so-called hard-headed détente, as the old theory is being purveyed today. Our next speaker is eminently qualified now to come and to respond to everything that Jim Kортер and Vladimir Bukovsky and I have said. Dr. John Ленчовски of the National Security Council. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Dick. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be able to come and address all of you today. It's a real honor to be amongst this company up here on the dais. I had some of the most educational and really thrilling years of my career working for Jim Kортер, and I'm awfully glad that I get to be with him a little bit this afternoon. My admiration for Vladimir Bukovsky is something which is not paralleled really with most anybody else in the world. This is a man who has single-handedly exposed the conflict between the logic and often the perverse logic of the mind versus what Whittaker Chambers once explained to us was the logic of the soul. And his writings on the whole question of the moral differences between communism and a free system ought to be required reading in every classroom in this country.